It's been 30 days since the war started. Not the war they talked about on the news for years. Not cyber skirmishes and proxy battles. Not diplomatic breakdowns and red lines crossed behind closed doors. I mean the real one. The one we all knew was coming. World War III. I'm still alive. For now. I'm writing this from a medical tent on the edge of a Polish logistics hub north of Lublin, packed shoulder to shoulder with civilians, conscripts, and wounded NATO personnel. We're exhausted, dehydrated, and half of us are sick from drinking water out of ditches. If someone's reading this, maybe you've survived too. But don't relax. Don't think the worst is over. It isn't. The worst is just getting started. When the invasion hit, I was in Kaunas, Lithuania, working freelance security. I'm ex-police, former military. I was doing private work, convoy escort and facility assessments. The kind of job that paid well enough to ignore the rising tension on the news. But the Russians didn't come the way anyone expected. It wasn't a border push. It wasn't a drawn-out escalation. It was a first strike decapitation campaign. Missiles rained down on Vilnius, Kaunas, and Rukla. In the first 90 minutes, 5 NATO command centers went dark. Satellites went offline. Drones froze midair. Then came the boots on the ground. Fast, organized, and brutally effective. Kaunas fell within 36 hours. I escaped on foot with a teenager named Andreas, a med kit, and a NATO map. We spent a week crossing forests and back roads to reach a resistance cell near Paunavezis. We linked up with an American and British unit, what was left of them, and fought our way to the Latvian border. We were lucky. Most weren't. I was processed into a NATO-controlled refugee hub on day 9, moved by armored convoy through Latvia and into eastern Poland. Thousands of civilians were flooding in from the Baltics. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all effectively occupied or under siege. Entire cities reduced to fire-blackened shells. Some evacuees had nothing but plastic bags, some not even shoes. A Polish soldier at the checkpoint told me the Russians were already pushing west to the Suwalki Gap, threatening to link up with Kaliningrad. I didn't have the energy to respond. We were packed into converted warehouses, rows of cots, no heat, minimal lighting. You could always tell which refugees came from further east by the smell of burned concrete clinging to their clothes. The only good news? NATO hadn't fractured. Yet. By day 13, the war had fully globalized. China announced diplomatic and material support for the Russian Federation. North Korea began mobilizing. Iran cut ties with multiple Western embassies, while proxy militias in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria began targeting U.S. outposts. On the other side, the United States activated full NATO support, deploying assets to Europe under Operation Iron Barrier. The UK, Germany, France, and Canada committed troops. Japan, Australia, and South Korea declared readiness to support if hostilities extended to the Pacific. Some countries stayed quiet. Some tried to stay neutral. But the lines were drawn now. This wasn't just Europe's war anymore. The camp was chaos. We weren't civilians and we weren't soldiers. We were something in between. At night, people cried in their sleep. During the day, I taught a few younger guys how to use their rifles without shooting their own feet off. On day 15, a Polish NATO officer named Captain Zielinska found me. "Your former military?" she asked. I nodded. "Congratulations, you're reactivated." By day 16, I was part of a civilian defense task unit, one of dozens being assembled to protect vital infrastructure, aid convoys, and secure fallback positions. We weren't special forces. We were the plugs in the dam. My unit was made up of 2 former Ukrainian border guards, a Romanian paramedic, a French logistics corporal with 2 weeks of combat experience, and a Latvian volunteer with a sniper's patience and a butcher's grin. We were assigned to convoy Echo 12, a humanitarian and resupply mission running from Lublin to a contested forward post near the Bug River. We departed at 4:30 on day 17. 4 cargo trucks, 2 Humvees, 1 mobile hospital rig. On board, medical supplies, food rations, trauma kits, and several crates labeled classified NATO command use only. We didn't ask what was inside those crates. We were told not to. Halfway to the river, our lead vehicle hit an IED. It wasn't a Russian strike, not conventional. No drones, no air support. This was asymmetrical warfare. The convoy scattered. Small arms fire from the tree line. Sniper rounds clipping the engine blocks. We returned fire and fell back into a ditch. I dragged the medic behind a blown-out wheel well. She was shaking, whispering. They weren't in uniform. They weren't Russian. She was right. They weren't regulars. They were locals. Armed civilians, probably pro-Russian sympathizers. The fog of war had settled in, and it wasn't lifting. We lost 2 trucks and 1 of the guards. Made it back to Lublin under blackout. Command was furious. Not because of the loss, but because one of the crates was taken. We were reassigned immediately. No debrief, no rest. The message was clear. There were no civilians anymore, only assets and threats. On day 20, word came through that Bialystok was under siege. Russian armor had crossed further west than expected. Airspace was compromised. NATO began priority relocation of command assets to hardened sites in Germany and Czechia. Everything east of Warsaw, holding ground or expendable. That included us. By day 22, the refugee camp I'd started in was under evacuation. By day 23, I stopped asking if we were winning. Because the war wasn't about victory anymore. It was about not being next. Day 24. We didn't hear the bombs drop. The first sign was the smell. A metallic tang that hit the back of your throat like blood and oil. Then the sky turned orange. Lublin was on fire. They hit the fuel depot first. 3 Russian cruise missiles launched from mobile launchers stationed east of Brest. The Polish air defense system caught one. 2 made it through. We were less than 5 kilometers away when the tanks lit up. I felt the shockwave in my spine before I saw the flames. The next 36 hours were chaos. We were ordered to fall back to a secondary logistics point near Palawi. The road was jammed with civilians fleeing and anything with wheels. Buses, motorcycles, even tractors. One family pushed a shopping cart loaded with blankets and a screaming infant. Everyone had the same look. Not terror, not grief. Just blank exhaustion. Like they'd already seen the end and were just walking through the ashes. I rode in the back of a Humvee with a Polish NCO named Radek and a French engineer named Delille. Both were younger than me. Both still thought NATO would push the Russians back. Maybe they were right. Maybe not. What I knew was this. Poland was the new front line, and we were the ones holding it. Day 26, Puławy. The new site wasn't much. A steel warehouse near a shuttered chemical plant, surrounded by woods and dirt roads. No perimeter, no real shelter, and no artillery protection. We put up HESCO barriers and set up mobile surveillance drones. Some Ukrainian units were moving in to reinforce, volunteers from Kharkiv and Odessa. They looked just as chewed up as we did. We weren't a base. We were a speed bump. Every night, we got fresh updates. Romania was reinforcing its northern border. Finland fully joined NATO, activating emergency deployment protocols. China officially declared Russia's invasion a legitimate response to NATO provocation. North Korean missile testing increased. Japan and South Korea activated their joint Pacific Readiness Plan. It was all becoming global. A massive chessboard. And most of the pawns didn't know they were already being sacrificed. On day 27, we had our first close contact. A Russian recon unit. 3 soldiers moving through the forest north of the plant. They weren't scouting terrain. They were tracking comms lines. We engaged, fast and brutal. Delille took a bullet through the calf. Radek's armor stopped 2 rounds before he dropped one of them with a clean headshot. We found encrypted gear on one of the bodies, Russian GRU. But what made my stomach twist wasn't the gear. It was the map we pulled from his pocket. It had our position circled. They knew we were here. Day 29. I woke up to shouting. One of the Ukrainian volunteers had gone missing. No signs of struggle, no blood. Just his rifle, sitting against the empty cot. Radek thought he deserted. I wasn't so sure. That night, we got hit. 312 mortar barrage. No air raid sirens, no UAVs. Just the whistle of shells falling in the dark. The chemical plant went up. White flames. Something spilled into the air that smelled like acid and ammonia. Delille was burned. We got him out, barely. Monroe, our senior officer, called in a retreat. Everything east of the Vistula is gone, she said. We fall back to Radom. Radom, bigger, better fortified, and now a major NATO holding zone. What was once a provincial city was now a garrison of sandbags, tanks, and long-range artillery. The problem? Getting there. Because between us and Radom were Russian saboteurs, retreating civilians, and roads slick with mud and fire. We moved at night. Convoy of 2 APCs, 4 trucks, and a med transport. 24 of us in total. No air cover, no drones. Just grit and silence. Halfway through the journey, we hit a minefield. Old Soviet stock, not mapped, not marked. The third truck was shredded. 4 dead, 2 missing legs. We pulled back and tried to go around. That's when we found the convoy. 6 Polish civilians, 2 cars, shot to pieces, not looted, not stripped. Executed. Close range, precise. 1 shot per head. Delisle muttered, "Why would Russians waste ammo on that?" Radek said nothing, just wiped his face and kept walking. I kept my eyes down, because I knew the answer. They weren't wasting ammo. They were sending a message. We reached Redham on day 30. Barely. The gates opened. NATO forces ushered us inside. Our vehicles were bleeding diesel, our people broken. The survivors lined up for triage, food and water. I saw a British infantryman lying on a stretcher, whispering for his mother. The medics said he'd walked through 3 artillery blasts before collapsing. Another one of us. That night, I sat against a bunker wall, watching the searchlights pan across the darkness. I thought about Kaunas. I thought about the people I couldn't save. And the ones I might still have to. Because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was fighting. Day 31, Radom, Poland. The air was thick with diesel, sweat, and adrenaline. The perimeter lights flickered as snow melted into mud, and the sound of distant artillery echoed through the valley like someone dropping steel slabs in a cathedral. The counteroffensive was coming, and we were the edge of it. I had 3 hours of sleep in a week. They gave us cots and rations when we arrived, but most of us couldn't sit still, let alone lie down. The chatter in the bunkers was constant. Who made it out of Pulawi? Who didn't? How many reinforcements were coming? Whether the Americans would finally bring in full air dominance. They didn't. They couldn't. Russian S-500 systems were saturating the skies from Kaliningrad to Belarus, overlapping radar networks and denying most drones and airstrikes past a few minutes. Every sortie had to be coordinated with surgical precision, and even then, the losses were brutal. So NATO did what it always does when tech hits a wall. We sent in people. Day 32. We were briefed in a prefab container-turned-ops room. A major from the U.S. 101st Airborne, Thompson, laid it out in simple terms. We are not winning this war. Not yet. But we are not surrendering an inch of Poland. Our objective was to launch a multi-unit strike to reclaim several key logistics corridors along the S-12 highway, just east of Radom. 3 NATO units. 1 American infantry company, 1 Polish mechanized platoon, and our ragtag multinational support squad. Our role: secure a demolished rail bridge and hold the crossing for NATO armor. We called it the Broken Tooth, because that's what it looked like on the map, and because it was going to be painful. We rolled out at 5 o'clock on day 33. Snow was falling again, light but enough to ice over the roads. The trucks rattled, the radios crackled. Nobody talked unless it mattered. I sat between Roddick and a Scottish comms tech named Gibbs. Gibbs had a wedding ring on a string around his neck and a photo of his daughter tucked in his plate carrier. He didn't say much, but when he spoke, you listened. We reached the outskirts of the Tooth by noon. Ruins, shell craters, half a mile of scorched trees. The bridge was gone, replaced by a twisted spine of iron and rebar over a dried riverbed. Our job was to cross, secure the far side, and hold until the mechanized units arrived. That meant infantry first. Always infantry first. We moved in 2 teams. My group took the southern flank through the remains of a grain silo. Delisle spotted movement before we crossed, shadows on the far ridge. Not regulars. Spetsnaz. They didn't shoot immediately. They waited. Watched. Then opened up with suppressed fire from the tree line. The fight was brutal. We moved cover to cover, suppressing with short bursts. Delisle took a round through the hip. Gibbs dropped one of their spotters with a lucky shot, then dragged Delisle to cover under heavy fire. Roddick and I flanked around a collapsed irrigation trench and pushed into a cluster of bombed-out sheds. We cleared them one by one. Shouts, flashbangs, short bursts. It was close. Too close. By the time the Polish IFVs arrived, the snow was soaked in blood and diesel. We lost 5. Killed 9. Secured the crossing. That night, we got word that Lviv had been hit by long-range hypersonic munitions. Thousands dead. Air defense completely overrun. NATO's eastern strategy shifted overnight. They weren't pushing east anymore. They were reinforcing Berlin. Day 34. Back in Radom, morale was low. We'd taken the objective, but the bigger picture was worse. Ukraine was in chaos. Romania was holding barely. Baltic partisans were still fighting behind lines, but with no real support. And Belarus had officially joined the war, sending troops into eastern Poland and Lithuania. Even Finland's border saw skirmishes. Everyone was in. In the mess tent, someone passed around a sat phone and a bottle of something that might have been vodka. One of the Canadians told me his wife and kids had made it out of Warsaw by train. Another said he hadn't heard from anyone in 6 days. No one said what we were all thinking. What happens if Berlin falls? Because if Berlin fell, there wouldn't be a NATO anymore. There'd just be survivors. Day 36. Orders came through. We were being deployed further west to Kielce, where Russian sabotage teams had destroyed 2 critical fuel depots. There were rumors of chemical agents, but nothing confirmed. Captain Monroe, our commanding officer since Lublin, gathered us outside the convoy trucks before we left. She didn't sugarcoat it. We are going into contested territory. You will see things that make no sense. That's war. Stay disciplined. Stay sharp. You are NATO's last spine on this line. If we fall here, the Vistula is next. We rolled out before dawn. Lights off. Engines low. No radios. The war wasn't over. Not even close. But for the first time since it started, I felt like we had a direction again. Maybe not hope, but purpose. And right now, that was enough. Day 37, en route to Kielce. The morning was colder than the rest. The air smelled like ozone and frostbite, and the roads were layered with slick ice and blackened rubber. I kept one hand on my rifle and the other on the dash as we rode in silence. No music. No chatter. Just the dull growl of engines and the quiet dread in everyone's eyes. We were escorting a NATO engineering convoy to Kielce, a key regional hub that had just lost 2 of its main fuel depots to Russian sabotage teams. No missiles, no drones, just infiltrators, likely Spetsnaz or Belarusian special forces, who slipped in through wooded corridors and planted charges. The fires had raged for 16 hours straight. We saw the smoke 50 kilometers out. The mission was clear. Secure the outer ring. Evacuate the injured. Set up forward defenses. Hold the perimeter until reinforcements arrived. We weren't the tip of the spear anymore. We were the damn handle, keeping it steady while everyone else bled. Kielce was in ruins. One depot had detonated so hard it cracked windows 5 blocks out. The second was still smoldering when we arrived. Blistered steel, melted rail cars, and the charred shells of fuel tankers fused to asphalt. There were bodies near the fences. Some burnt, some in fragments. No uniforms. They could have been civilian. Could have been saboteurs. We didn't stop to check. The air was thick with particulate. Every breath tasted like charcoal and rot. We set up our command post in a half-collapsed warehouse, steel beams bent like spaghetti, concrete floors cracked like ice. Radek strung razor wire across the loading bays, while Monroe assigned snipers to the rooftop shell. We had less than 2 hours before sunset, and our drone coverage was down. Command said Russian UAVs were hunting signals. So we kept the radios dark. We were back to analog. Maps, flashlights, radios with whisper volume. Like it was 1942 all over again. Day 38, 3:27. They came in the dark. No vehicles, no drones, just feet. Silent, precise. I was on the east flank with Delile and 2 Polish conscripts when I saw the first shadow breach the fence. I signaled. No shots. We let them in. Waited. Watched. 3-man team. Balaclavas, suppressed AKs, thermal optics. Professional. Delile threw a flare over the fence as a distraction. I dropped the first guy when he turned. Delisle got the second. The third slipped away, vanished into smoke and snow. But we found what they were carrying. Explosives, timers, injection syringes. That last one chilled us. We didn't ask what the syringes were for. We just logged them and handed them over to command. But the message was clear. They weren't just blowing up fuel. They were poisoning the survivors. Day 39. NATO finally hit back. A coordinated strike from U.S., Polish, and Romanian forces targeted Russian staging areas in western Belarus. Cruise missiles, long-range artillery, and a barrage of drone swarms broke up a supply column near Brest. We saw the footage that afternoon on a tablet passed around the barracks. Burning tanks. Panicked troops running across snowy fields. one of our drones laser painting a command vehicle before it vanished in a fireball. For the first time in a while, we cheered. We knew it wouldn't last. But it felt good to win one. That same day, a UN statement was leaked. Unofficial channels. One paragraph stood out. Full-scale NATO-SCO conflict is now mathematically inevitable unless a ceasefire is brokered within 21 days. SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and others. India was still quiet. China wasn't. Their navy had begun shadowing NATO ships in the South China Sea. And they'd held joint air drills with Russian aircraft near the Sea of Japan. Global, total, uncontainable. Day 40. Radek and I were sent to secure an old communications relay tower on the city outskirts. Intel said it might still be operational. Maybe we could link it into a satellite bounce and pull drone imagery from NATO command. It was a ghost town. Shattered windows. Icy roads. One shoe sitting in the middle of an intersection. No bodies. Too quiet. We swept the building. 3 floors, half collapsed. Wind howling through blown-out insulation. Radek took point. I covered. We found 2 things. A working relay. A frozen soldier in a Ukrainian uniform, his radio still buzzing weakly, frost over his eyelids. We logged his gear, pulled his ID, and reported back. Command said he'd gone missing 8 days ago. We never figured out how he got there. But we marked his location for recovery. You don't leave people behind. Not if you can help it. Day 42. The engineers finished reinforcing the depot ruins with metal barricades and old train cars. It wasn't much. But it was something. I sat on the hood of a Humvee that night, cleaning my rifle in the glow of a kerosene lamp, listening to the distant sounds of indirect fire way off near Warsaw. Monroe came by. No clipboard, no orders. She lit a cigarette, sat next to me and asked, "You think we'll win this?" I thought about it. Then I said, "We're still here, aren't we?" She smiled without humor. "Yeah, for now." Day 43. We got word that Warsaw was being evacuated. Not a drill, not partial, full evac. That hit different. Warsaw had been a symbol, NATO's eastern staging ground, a political line in the sand. If Warsaw fell, Poland's spine cracked in half. Command didn't spin it. The Russians were pushing with heavy armor from Belarus, and intel suggested possible Chinese drones providing battlefield recon. They weren't in the fight officially, but it didn't matter. Their tech was. We were told to fall back to Radom again, this time not to hold it, but to abandon it. Our new objective: establish a defensive line along the Vistula River, stretching from Plok in the north to Tarnobrze in the south. That river became our new wall, and we were the mortar holding it together. Day 45. The fall of Warsaw wasn't announced over the radio. It came in waves of people. Convoys, civilians, shot-up ambulances. Some had kids, some were missing limbs, some just stared at the road in front of them, like if they blinked, they'd remember too much. We were stationed near Kozienichi, helping direct refugee traffic over the only intact bridge in our sector. Each hour, I watched another piece of civilization roll past. A surgeon from Lublin carrying his daughter in a shopping bag. A group of Ukrainian volunteers pushing a wheelchair made of 2 shopping carts and duct tape. A nun who didn't speak a word but handed me a crucifix and walked off barefoot into the trees. I kept the crucifix, even though I don't pray anymore. Day 46. That's when the Russians came again. Not a wave. Not an armored division. Just probes. Fast recon teams. Sniper groups, spec ops. They'd test the line, peel away, test another spot. It was smart, efficient, and terrifying. Because it meant they weren't desperate. They were calculated. And worse, we weren't. Day 47. Command said a major assault was imminent within 48 hours. We prepped trenches, laid mines, reinforced barricades using anything we could find. Sandbags, cars, even smashed refrigerators. I helped a 17-year-old kid from Gdansk set his first claymore. He was shaking so badly I had to steady his hands. His name was Mateusz. He used to work in a gaming cafe. Now he was lining up kill zones. Welcome to the new normal. Day 48. It started at 2:16. Artillery first. Saturating the tree line to the northeast. Then the drones. The Chinese-made ones moved like birds. Small, fast, silent. We didn't hear them until they were already relaying coordinates. NATO's counter-drone units tried to jam the signal, but it was too late. The first Russian push came at 3 o'clock. Mechanized infantry backed by APCs, supported by Belarusian mortar teams and long-range rockets. We held. Barely. I remember seeing Gibbs, the Scottish comms tech, run out into the open with a shoulder-fired SAM and take out a drone just before it dropped a sensor pod on our position. He didn't make it back, but the pod missed. And so we lived. The fight lasted 6 hours. The river held. But the cost? 17 dead. 31 wounded. We'd stopped the assault, but we'd lost too many to hold another. Day 49. Reinforcements came in the form of U.S. Army Stryker units, rolling in like steel bulls across the field. They didn't smile. They didn't talk much. But they held the line. We finally got a breath. Just a breath. That night, Radek and I sat by a burned-out mobile comms truck, passing a water bottle back and forth like it was scotch. He looked up at the stars and said, "I always thought the end would be louder." I didn't have the heart to tell him this wasn't the end. It was the middle. And we were nowhere near finished. Day 50. We received confirmation that NATO reinforcements from Germany had pushed into western Poland. U.S. armored divisions. British logistics and artillery. French mechanized infantry. Even the Italians had deployed air defense units into the Czech Republic. They were finally committing in full. But it still felt like we were behind. We weren't fighting for territory anymore. We were fighting for time. The Russians were trying to encircle the Vistula line. They didn't need to break through everywhere. They just needed one breach. One gap. And the whole front would fold like paper in the wind. Our sector, south of Warsaw, was thin. Stretched too far, too fast. Refugees behind us, Russians in front of us, and barely enough munitions to last a second wave. Captain Monroe called in everything she could. Spare units, volunteers, partisans. Anyone who could hold a rifle. That's when we saw the Baltic irregulars roll in. They came in old trucks, camouflaged by mud and smoke. Lithuanian and Estonian volunteers, what was left of a militia that had been fighting a guerrilla war behind Russian lines for 3 weeks. They looked like ghosts, but they knew how to fight, and they didn't flinch. Day 52. Russia launched simultaneous attacks along 5 Vistula sectors. Our flank held the worst of it. APCs, infantry, rocket barrages. I manned a heavy MG mounted on a Humvee, chewing through wave after wave of soft targets trying to cross the river on inflatable boats and makeshift rafts. We lost one of the river bridges in the north. A NATO drone strike collapsed it just as Russian armor tried to push across. Right call. But it cost us 3 scouts who were still posted on the far side. They never made it back. Radek and I took turns sleeping, 90 minutes at a time, under the shattered canopy of a logistics truck. We were running on caffeine pills and muscle memory. I told him, if I didn't make it, to send a message to my brother in Berlin. He said he'd already written a letter to his parents and kept it in his boot. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. There's a good chance we're not making it out of this. Day 53. The Russians stopped pushing. Not everywhere, just in our sector. We didn't know if it was regrouping or redirection. But we used every second of that pause to dig in deeper. NATO drones returned to the sky for the first time in 3 days. F-35s roared overhead, conducting low runs in support of a coordinated counteroffensive stretching from Krakow to Lublin. NATO was punching back. Hard. Day 55. We received confirmation that Finland and Sweden were now conducting joint operations with Norwegian and U.S. forces to cut off Kaliningrad. Turkey had sealed its borders. Japan had issued a direct warning to China over its non-involvement. The world was inching closer to the edge, but for now, no nukes had flown. And somehow, that still felt like a miracle. I was reassigned to civilian evac coordination near Kielce, pulling women and children out of shelters that used to be office buildings. One boy handed me a drawing. Me, holding a gun, standing on top of a tank. He said I looked strong like a wolf. I nearly cried. I hadn't felt strong in weeks. Day 58. We were ordered to rotate out for 48 hours. Rest, wash, eat. Not because it was safe, but because no one can hold a rifle forever. I showered for the first time in 18 days. The water was cold. The soap was industrial grade. But I felt almost human again. Almost. Day 60. 1 month since it started. 1 month since the siren. The missiles. The sprint through Lithuania. The trenches in Poland. The dead friends. The burnt maps. The mud. The smoke. The noise. They say the front is stabilizing. They say NATO has the upper hand. They say we might make it through the winter. But I've learned not to believe what they say. I believe in one thing now. The man next to me. If he's still breathing. If he still gets up when the order comes. Then so will I. And that's how I've survived the first month of World War III. Not because I'm brave. Not because I'm strong. But because I don't have another choice. And neither do you.